Welcome, everybody, and greetings. I'm Helen Hudson, President of the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the August edition of Virtual Lunch with the League. Lunch with the League is a monthly forum designed to inform the public about issues of community interest and concern. This is the fifth in our special 2020 series done online. I invite you to view earlier programs on our website, on our Facebook page, and on our YouTube channel. Our first three programs of the year, thanks to Marco's initiative, were also recorded, and so they can also be watched on our YouTube. The League of Women Voters is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government, but always working on vital issues of concern to members and the public. At this time, I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Our guest speaker and presenter today is Raul Moore. Raul is a lifelong resident of Montgomery County and a lifelong lover of woodlands and forests. I won't give you more data here about Raul, as he will tell us more about his life story as part of his presentation. Raul is currently president of the Indiana Forestry Woodlot Owners Association, an organization that has over 150 woodlot owner members across the state. Thank you so much, Raul, for bringing us this presentation. Also with us today to serve as one of our questioners is Ed Fain. Ed is a retired engineer who is now giving lots of his talents toward community improvement through various arts, church, and public service organizations. Currently, Ed is president of the board of Friends of Sugar Creek, and it is in this capacity that he joins us today. Thank you so much, Ed.
You're welcome.
Marco Dees is the cornerstone of our Lunch with the League programs. He coordinates Lunch with the League and is production manager and editor for these virtual programs. Thank you so much, Marco.
Happy to help.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome all of you who are watching online. Maybe you're watching on our typical first Monday or some other time. We're glad to have you. We have had, in some of our earlier virtual presentations, up to 1,000 viewers worldwide of these programs. So we encourage you all to share it if you like what you see and help us spread the information on these issues of vital concern. I'd now like to turn the program over to Raul Moore.
Well, thank you, Helen. I was thinking as this was getting set up that nervous public speakers are supposed to envision the audience naked, and since this is virtual, this may actually be occurring right now somewhere in the world if there's 1,000 people. So I would like to start with a PowerPoint that Lenny Farley, an extension forester, he also works at the HTIRC. He was my first district forester from Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry, when I got serious about growing trees. So I've known Lenny a while, and this is his presentation. I'm going to talk through it, though. So Indiana was, well, first of all, I hated history as a kid. I want to know what was going to happen next, what's going to happen next week, 3 years from now. Behind of me doesn't matter. But I finally realized that where you're going depends on where you are and how you're moving. What's your vector and what's your position? So we need to know how Indiana forests got here, this generation of Indiana forests. There's been 4 major glaciations in Indiana. The latest kind of melted out about, I don't know, 13,000 years ago. Interesting, I can go down rabbit holes and spend half an hour in each rabbit hole. I could spend 2 hours on glaciation, post-glaciation landforms, since that's one of the things I studied in college, but I can't. Cool factoid, coming off that huge mass of ice was a cold wind. There was always a cold wind coming off it unless the weather system pushed, so it was always a breeze coming off there. It was cold. Honey locust, those are the trees with the massive thorns. I've seen them 16 inches long, or like hair all over the trunk. And they also have a thornless cultivar they use in landscaping now in urban environments. It has a double compound leaf, but it has big thorns. And we think in Africa, trees with big thorns are to keep the elephants from pushing them over and eating their seeds and foliage. Well, honey locust, one of the reasons it's called honey is the seed pods. If you didn't have corn syrup and honey, and well, if all you had was honey and maple syrup, it might taste kind of sweet. So we think that might be to keep the woolly mammoths and mastodons off. Heard an interesting thing on, I listen to a lot of science shows because I'm alone in the woods by myself a lot, so I listen to NPR. And there was a scientist on talking about in Europe, she had been studying radioactive carbon transfer between different species of trees. And on the left side, you see a bi-culture, two different trees kind of, and I've been up north in the United States, and sure enough, there are places where there's only two species of trees, and I can fully understand where they might be cooperating. In Indiana today, it's a lot different. We're not cooperating. It's root hog or die. If you haven't been to Pine Hills, Shades, Turkey Run, I strongly suggest you go there. It's really cool. When the Native Americans had their highest population densities here, and it was fairly large, actually, we think. I read the book 1941, and by the time white culture had arrived to document what was there, a lot of them had died off of diseases. So we had fairly high population densities. They were doing slash and burn agriculture. And in order to keep the deer out of their slash and burn, they were pushing the deer back about a day's hike out, and they were actively predating pregnant does in the spring to keep the population down. There's something called an earthworm line from glaciation that, well, all the earthworms underneath the glaciers died, and they don't move very fast to come back in. If you want to see something that'll make your hair fall out, that's what I've been doing, is researching jumping worms or Korean jumping worms. It's changing the landscape. So there are early diary entries of early settlers coming in with 3 feet of leaves on the ground because the earthworms weren't underneath eating them up. So fires blew in from the prairies. There were prairie savannas in holdings inside the forest cover. We'll see that in a minute. There was a lot of fire, we think, from doing sediment cores in some of the ponds, that every 3 to 7 years, Indiana was burned. It was low, slow fires like this. It wasn't fire nados. The fire nados were out in the prairies. They came into the woods. They came burning through. The natives were also burning the understory to make better graze for game and also open it up so they could see enemies coming in to attack them. So when the whites came to this landscape, it was a patchwork of uneven age stands, especially down where they were doing slash and burn. So they'd come up, they'd grow up, they'd come back later, burn it, farm it until the soil ran out and move on. It was a lot of forests. There were large prairie sections. I went to a great presentation on section corners, people who had been the surveyors, and they described the last mile that they had done dragging chains through the landscape. And there was a lot more savannas than we might think. There are lots of little packets of savannas in there being kept open by really hot fires. We'll talk about fire maybe when we get to oaks later. Big old trees, yes, oaks can go to 350 years, but we're finding now that unless it's on a really good site, there's a lot of mortality now at about 100, 120 years. There's a lot of oaks falling out of the forest because they're just, some of us die when we're 50 and some of us live to 104. It's the same way with trees. So I took dendrology at Purdue, which is the study of tree identification. And the professor had a diary entry from the 1860s where some settlers got on their horses and they decided to go fox hunting like they did in the old country. And they got down by the Ohio River and they found this big sycamore tree that was basically a hollow tube with a few live branches holding everything together and keeping it alive. And they said, well, I wonder how many horses can go in, because there's these big arches that you could ride your horse through. The 17th horse balked and would not go inside the hollow sycamore tube. These things were huge. Should have been the state tree, but too late now. So I read an interesting book by a Johnson, who was, his grandfather was one of the settlers where the state fairgrounds are now, talking about how life on the frontier. So they were just cutting the trees down, getting rid of them so they could farm. On our farm, there's a map from 1860 that has a grist mill on it. So I'm pretty sure, and there's, in order to divert the water into that grist mill, was a weir in Sugar Creek. You can still see the base logs when the creek's down, and farther downstream, in order to harvest ice for the brickyard, which was across the creek from the farm, they had built a cribbing dam, and they'd fill it up with brush in the fall, and then they would harvest the ice in the winter. And you can still see those two, those base logs down there. A lot of stuff was cut. We pretty much cut most of it. Big trees, just in the way. My father had a great story back in the early 30s. He's up in southern Michigan planting walnut trees, and a farmer drove by in an old Model T, I guess it was not an old one at that point, pickup truck, and stopped and watched him for a while and said, "Sonny, you know, when I was a kid, we were burning those 3-foot walnut trees just to get rid of them." So 1860, interesting factoid. I go to a lot of trainings. I listen to a lot of people with letters after their names. At this point in the state, every acre was charged property tax exactly the same. It's only fair, right? It's equitable. But, you know, my wonderful alluvial soils here in Montgomery County got charged the same per acre as the dry sandstone ridge tops down in southern Indiana that couldn't grow anything. So after they'd cleared it all to farm, lo and behold, you had to pay property taxes. So even the stuff that hadn't been cleared for farming was at that point cleared to pay property taxes. So a lot of railroad ties and clothespins came off just to get property taxes. We'd opened up a lot of ground here that just did not make sense. A lot of this went down to build the Delta at New Orleans, and some of it got deposited in my alluvial soils from my upstream neighbors. They walked away. A lot of areas walked away. I can remember as a kid going way back through Turkey Run and going to what I think was called the Camelbacks, and it looked a lot like that. It's just highly eroded. I went back a couple years ago. Couldn't see it. It's been regenerated. Trees have come back onto it, and it's building soil again. A lot of hogs, a lot of grazing. Honey locust has a sweet seed pod. Animals like to eat the seed pods. They deposit the seeds with fertilizer. As soon as those honey locusts come out of the ground, they have these needle-sharp thorns, and nobody's going to eat them. So where you've had grazing, you see a lot of honey locust. A lot of changes. Lost a lot of animals. Exploited a lot of things during the Depression. There was a lot of meat hunting going on during the Depression. That was really hard. When I was a kid, there were still people who had been hunting in the Depression, liked to hunt, and they were teaching their kids. That culture is pretty much going away. So in about 1900 or so, they looked around and said, holy moly, what happened to our forest? So they made state parks. Shades Turkey Run got saved at that point. A lot of the ground that had been walked away from because all the topsoil had left. After you remove the forest cover, topsoil tends to move down slope. And so the state forest, a lot of stuff happened then. 1921, next year, 100-year anniversary of the Classified Forest Program was created to help landowners offset property taxes to promote forestry. There's a lot of strings attached, and it is exploding recently because it is a tax savings. This looks like a CCC picture from the 30s. A lot of people planting trees. I think we should maybe do CCC again. There's a lot of things we can put people to work at. Old folk, young folk, picking up trash, planting trees, killing invasive plants, which we're going to get to eventually. So here we have an Indiana forest today. General rule, about in a normal Indiana forest, 10% of the trees hold 90% of the value, economic value. So most of the trees are junk. People don't want to spend money doing what's called timber stand improvement, going in and weeding, getting rid of trees that have little economic value. And we're blessed here, the trees with high economic value the ones that make nice nuts that feed animals, also have high wildlife value. So there's a win-win when I'm planting trees. I'm planting oaks, pecans, walnuts, and the critters love it, and those are also the high value ones. So I can remember back in the 60s driving around as a kid, and occasionally you'd go past a woods that was being burned for making better grays. So we've taken off a lot of our forest. You can see there, most of the forest is family owned. There are, however, large state and land trust holdings. One of my early memories, my father had 3 groups of friends. There were the fruit nuts, the timber nuts, and the nut nuts, because he was a horticulturalist. And I can remember the timber nuts sitting around, and they were complaining about Dutch elm disease had come through, and the elms were all dying. Well, gosh, there's nothing we can really do. And the upshot was, well, we really don't like elm. My father could remember the chestnut snags when he grew up in upstate New York. On the horizon, there's a lot of really nasty things. The downside of globalization. There's a lot of things moving around. Emerald ash borer came in untreated wood pallets. I don't know why we're allowing untreated wood pallets to be shipped all around the world. Plastic pallets make a lot of sense to me, or you can cook them, or you can fumigate them, but why are we moving around predators, insects, fungi, all kinds of good stuff? Doesn't make sense to me, but hey. So I'm going to pose a question. How much are you willing to pay for the landscape you desire? And there are capital costs, upfront costs. There are costs in the future, and there are opportunities costs, lost opportunity. On my farm, or the family's farm, on Sunday, you can hear church bells from Crawfordsville. To the west of me is 231 Shrubberbia. To the east of me is 47 Shrubberbia. So I am ahead of most people in Montgomery County, but not most people, well, I'm ahead of most people in the state. If you live near an urban area where there's all these people planting these wonderful plants that are so nice and ornamental, and they have little small flowers, and they smell so good, and 80% of invasive plants are escaped ornamentals. We have met the enemy, he is us. On the farm, when I started attacking bush honeysuckle, it was solid canopy, bare dirt underneath. If we don't get rid of some of these plants, they form monocultures, and they do not allow anything to grow underneath them. Bush honeysuckle is also allelopathic, which means its roots put out a toxin that attacks the microcilia, the fungi in the soil, slowing down root systems in competing plants. They've done a study, 70% decrease of existing trees when you have solid bush honeysuckle. Garlic mustard's another one. Walnut, if you're a gardener, you know you can't plant tomatoes underneath a walnut tree. So there's a lot of stuff going on. If we don't take care of this particular plant, where it gets established, the trees that are standing are the last trees that are going to be on site. So how much are you willing to pay for the landscape you desire? And that landscape is going to cost us all in the future when I get to economic impact. So I'm fighting about 25 plants that are non-native on the farm. Tree of heaven there, be careful. If you're allergic and you get sawdust on you, you may well wind up in ER with cardio problems. A lot of those plants do form monocultures. They're fairly site specific. I know a lot of forester, one of them says, yeah, you can have 25 and there'll be 7 that are monsters and the other 18 are just kind of there. So different sites have different problems, but it's the end of the forest as we know it. So there's different times: fruit fly time, human time, tree time, landscape time, going back to the glaciers. It's been 13,000 years or so. So in tree time, those are very scary. 1978, the deer finally made it back north of Crawfordsville. We think that the Native Americans had the deer population down to about 1.5 deer per 100 acres of woodlands. Talking to people with letters after their name, they tell me they think the carrying capacity of the understory of Indiana forests is about 2.5 deer per 100 acres, or about 15 deer per square mile. In March, when the deer clump up, I can look out and see 30 to 40 deer. Deer are a problem. If I don't plant at least 5 acres at 1,000 trees per acre, I can kiss all the trees goodbye. So I'm planting 10 acres at 1,000 trees. Actually, I'm going to fit 1,200 trees per acre next spring, just to get some trees that the deer like past the deer. I read an interesting article on earthworms, and all the earthworm people think the earthworms are destroying the understory. Well, by looking at that picture, I think it's deer. Deer just come in. There are certain plants, the only place you see them is where they are coming up inside a down treetop, and the deer just cannot get to them. Deer are a problem. And I have a lot of sympathy for DNR. There's conflict between the forestry and people and the recreation or the hunting people. People want to be able to go out and go, well, I don't want that deer and I don't want that deer. Oh, there's the one I want, as opposed to go out for 5 days and finally see a deer to shoot. So there's a conflict. This is another existential threat to woodlands. Fragmentation is both ownership, which decreases the ability to have a sale. Having a timber sale has a really high overhead. The equipment's very expensive, and you have to come in, unload everything, do the sale, clean up after the sale, load everything up, and leave. And if you're trying to do 6 acres, unless you're harvesting really high-end timber, it's not going to happen. So either a lot of the sales are going to have to be cooperative sales, which is going to be really hard because, hey, I had this cottonwood tree that was 3 feet in diameter, it was 50 feet straight as an arrow to the first branch, and you just had 3 little trees and you got more money. And I do a lot of grade school outreach, and I say, well, if you have that cottonwood tree and you sell it, you can buy the best ergonomic wheelbarrow in the world. 2 wheels, pneumatic, properly balanced, a bin you can mix mortar in. It's wonderful. Or if you had a walnut tree the same, you might be able to get a dually pickup truck. So fragmentation also has really important consequences ecologically. We're finding that we have a lot of postage stamp woods up in the northern part of the state. In little ecosystems, the box turtle is endangered or threatened because they can't hook up anymore. So wildlife corridors connecting these little postage stamp woods are really important so that the animals can get together and make babies. So Indiana woods, that looks like a really nice woods. Doesn't look like my woods, that looks like an upland woods. I have a lot of riparian zones. It is fire nettles, vines, just a riot of growth, although that is wintertime. So there's something called the HE, which I'll have a website later on. I'm gonna let you go look at. Did a lot of studying. We find that a lot of species like openings. They may not be nesting there or sleeping there, but they sure are feeding there. Butler brought in a scientist a couple years ago. She was called an arbornaut, and she had spent 30 years investigating the top layer of the forests all around the world. The top where the sun is new vegetation, flowers, fruits, insects, things that eat all of those things, things that eat the things that eat all of the things. The activity is where the sun is. When you open up and let the sun on the soil, you let a whole new cadre of wildlife and plants win because now there's sun there. So all of your briars and raspberries, blackberries, all kinds of stuff is happening on the soil. I've been creating a habitat for 20 years, and the 20-year-old stuff, that's all gone. All those critters, all those plants, it's gone. Canopy is closed. It's 30, 40 feet tall now. Forget it. Those guys have all lost. So we need openings to feed in, and we sleep out in the deep forest. A lot of interesting stuff. So that's the end of Lenny's presentation. I am now going to switch to one that I made, if I can find it down here. All right, so 1956, my father did not get tenure at Wabash, and my folks dropped out. Father was a horticulturalist. He started taking care of the woods, cleaning up the jungle. The stuff that he was cleaning up was at that point about 13 years old, counting the ring. So it was harvested in 43. I've been told it was probably harvested for gun stocks for the war. Before that, it was probably harvested in the early 1800s when white culture was building mills and bridges and putting weirs in the creek and barns and stuff. And we're getting ready for the next harvest in the next 20 years or so. We'll be big enough to harvest again. So this is a renewable thing. In 2000, the neighbor's farm came up, and we got the opportunity to start scaling our scale. So we are scaling. I'm finding that a lot of my life has been doing different things, and I've had a lot of pointy-haired boss. I am the pointy-haired boss. So I get to spend a lot of time outside. This little deer fawn came up to me this spring when the kids were small. We had a book that said, "Are you my mother?" He said, "Are you my mother?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not your mother." So I'm outside a lot. So here's a tree that my father rescued in 1956, getting close to harvest. Here's a picture of its landscape that it's in. Once more, this is floodplains, not uplands. Here's a tree that I planted, looks like about 3 years ago. It's gotten past the deer, has a little bit of dicamba damage there on those fresh leaves. It's opening, it's open like that. I can show you lots of pictures. This is not a silviculture lecture. This is agroforestry. So I have a lot of stuff that looks like that. I have some threats. 2017, if you want to see something really cool, go to where 175 East crosses Sugar Creek and look to the northwest, and you will see an area there where a microburst came down. So this is a very powerful downdraft in a thunderstorm. And it took out a circle that's 100, 150 feet in diameter. There's a tree in the middle about 30 feet up that's just folded in half. This is not a tornado. This was a microburst coming down, and that microburst moved for about 3 miles across the surface of the earth. About a mile on us, took out about a dozen crop walnut trees and at least that many trees out of a plantation. So lightning is a problem. Tornadoes and winds are a problem. But the real problem is climate change. Global warming, climate crisis, I don't care what you call it. Words get changed over time and they lose their meanings. They get banned. You can't say words, climate change. I'm going to call it climate change. Some of the projections I've heard is that the climate here in Indiana may look like West Texas. I've never been to West Texas. There's nothing to take me to West Texas, but I did see the last picture show, and I do not remember verdant forests in the backgrounds of the outside shots from the last picture show. So I am worried that climate change is going to be a problem. Markets. We have some choices for building materials, and I'm worried that some people don't like wood. Well, if you want to build stuff and you want to live inside, you're going to have something. You want to have metal. Well, metal, big holes in the ground, smelting, mine tailings, power, energy to smelt, make ingots. I'm not really keen on metal. Cement, I did a tour of the cement factory down in Greencastle. There's a lot of BTUs there. If you don't get the fire right, there can be a lot of pollution coming out of that. I'm assuming they're getting the fire right. Don't know. A lot of energy in cement. Plastic is the real one that worries us. It looks, I mean, I can't tell. I grow trees. I'm not a woodworker. You look at some of this fake wood and I can't tell. Well, plastic at this point is coming from oil. Probably not a good thing. Maybe we can make it out of corn. I think we can. Haven't scaled that. So plastic is my real worry. In the world, I'm throwing this, so there's different markets for wood. At the very bottom, you have pallet wood and crating. It's called industrial grade. And a lot of those trees will not pay their way out of the forest. If you have a long skid to get up to the skid yard, and you have a tree that's worth $20 and it's going to fall in the creek or go over a hill or anything's wrong, forget it. You can't sell it. There's not enough value there. So as you start moving up in the grades, you get to the internal frames for furniture. We want stable wood. If the wood is stable and hard, it can be used for flooring. I don't understand why my wood, here raised sustainably, certified by Forest Sustainability Council, competes with bamboo from Southeast Asia that people think is so green. Well, I haven't investigated bamboo, but I have heard about shrimp farming in Southeast Asia and how horrible it is. I know in general, developing world environmentalism is fairly non-existent. So don't know how the bamboo's raised, but then it's put in a container and it's shipped across the largest ocean in the world. And then it's moved 2/3 of the way across the continent to get here. I just can't see bamboo flooring. But as you move farther up, you start getting into furniture wood. Another part of that stable wood is what I call pig wood, and we'll come to that here in the next couple of minutes. So after you get past the flooring and pig wood, stable wood, you get into solid wood for furniture. That's a nice market. But the top is what I call lipstick, and we put lipstick on pigs because the pigs are solid and stable, and we can glue a really thin layer of veneer on top of it and make it look like it's solid wood, and it goes a lot farther. That market is global. It is fungible, which means it's shipped all over the world. It has enough value that you can throw it in a container and ship it wherever you want in the world and sell it and still make a profit. So the high-end market, which I'm trying to hit, is a global market, and I'm competing against third world logging. Now, it's on the other side of the world, and it's brown brothers and sisters. So it really bothers me as a capitalist that I'm competing against areas that have no private property, no rule of law. Money goes to corrupt military and political leaders. There are no rules in the logging. If you protest too much, you get disappeared into the jungle. If it's flat, it gets converted to beans or cattle or palm oil. If it's rugged, it's usually raining a lot in the tropics. And there's a certain type of soil, I forget the name of it. I took a course on this kind of stuff at Purdue one semester. And when there's a lot of rain and steep slopes, all organics are in play. As soon as something hits the ground and starts to rot, the nutrients are picked up by the root systems of the plants that are there and put back into living material. When you come in and harvest, you take out the living material, the organics leave down slope, and it may take 1,000 years to rebuild the soil. It's tough. Also, when you get into rugged, mountainous, tropical territories, there are watersheds that are unique. They've been developing for a really long time. We think 13,000 years is a long time since the glaciers melted. This is not a long time. They have developed unique ecosystems. We have not cataloged a lot of the species in the world. We haven't looked at them. We don't know what they are. We haven't collected their genetic material, and we certainly haven't looked at them for pharmacological potential. And we're going in and we're harvesting that, and I'm competing against that wood. And as an environmentalist, that really honks me off. Anyway, I could go on and on and on about this. As you can tell, I'm very passionate. However, I do have a horse in the race. My horse is not leading at this point. So in getting a little more local, in Indiana, we have markets that at this point are still very strong. However, there is a movement in agriculture and business, which is get big or get out. Loggers have the highest workman compensation in the state. It's very dangerous. We're losing a couple a year. There's a lot of physics when trees are falling. Things fly around. You can fall down and get hurt, limbs whip back. That's just the deaths, a couple of deaths a year. So we're moving into more large equipment, which if used properly can be much lighter on the land. This is good. You can be more efficient. You can be safer. So, however, it means there's a lot of people can't afford the equipment anymore. And I'm worried that the trees I plant take on average about 100 years to get to market. In 100 years, I don't know what the market's going to look like, because I think we've peaked on productive land in Indiana, wood production land, because of fragmentation, philosophical reasons for not harvesting. And I'm worried that I'm going to be trying to put, if it hasn't turned into West Texas, I'm going to be putting wood up into a market that is dominated by a couple of large players. And looking at the history of farmers who have to deal with consolidated inputs and consolidated markets, there's been a lot of efforts for co-ops over the years. It's not necessarily going to be good. Right now in Indiana, we have about 70,000 jobs from wood. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary production. When you die, you get a casket from Batesville. You're now sitting, I see Helen has wood in her background. Hopefully it's from Indiana, or at least the United States. Looks like veneer. Has trim, hopefully from Indiana. It probably is, because it's not worthwhile to ship trim boards all around. $10 billion a year of economic activity in Indiana from wood. It is the single largest legal agricultural crop in Indiana. Larger than corn, larger than beans. And $585 million per year of state and local taxes. How much are you willing to pay for the landscape you desire in Indiana? As a private landowner, I know what I'm willing to pay to create the landscape that I want. But as a citizen of Indiana, be careful. Some geese lay golden eggs. So that the economic information came out of this hardwood report that came out. I have a question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, this report landed. So there's price report with a link. There's Division of Forestry, who does inventories. It's really nice. We need to know what we have. So this slide here, I call the wedge slide. And I spent a long time looking at that slide. And when I finally understood that slide, it scared me. If you look at that slide, you see there's a huge salmon colored thing at the right-hand corner. And it's the size class as you get bigger across the bottom. So if you look at that, we have a lot of oaks that are kind of old, but we have hardly any oaks that are kind of young. We have some beech and maple that are old, but we have a lot of young beech and maple. This is the future of Indiana woodlands without human intervention. If you like the woods we have in Indiana today, let's clear the state and start again, because that's what we did to create the woodlands that we have now. We put sun on the soil and we burned it. If you like to work outside and you're a pyromaniac, apply to the Nature Conservancy. I have a lot of respect for the Nature Conservancy. They are burning, trying to get oaks back into the understory. If once the root collar on an oak seedling gets to be about 1.5 inches, it can withstand a forest fire, an Indiana forest fire, not a fire NATO, but a slow going through the woods. However, the thin bark, the beech and the maple die. So if you burn a couple of times, you can knock down those fast growing trees that compete against the oaks, get the oaks established, then take off the layer of trees that are kind of shading things, and you have a chance, if there's not too many deer, of getting oaks back into the landscape. If you don't put sun on the soil, you're not going to get very many oaks. Yes, there are blowdowns, but as a landowner, this last sale, I made some openings because, hey, practice what you preach, right? Openings look tough. There's nothing there. But over time, lo and behold, trees come back. So that slide, if you can get that wedge slide through your head, I think it's kind of the end of the argument. Next, we have a Forest of Indiana. So this is the feds, I believe. I'd have to look at it again. And there's a bar graph. I don't care if you like bar graphs or wedge slide, either one. They show the same thing. And finally, there's the website for IFWA. And at that point, there's a lot of links on IFWA. IFWA, there's 3 statewide forestry organizations. They all do slightly different things, but IFWA kind of does it all. So I think we have 500 members. I don't know how many actual landowners, how many parcels that represents, but we're old, we're cantankerous, and we're our own bosses. So it's hard to get people to coordinate. If you want to blow a room of people up, talk about changing the roles on classified forest. Okay, so at that point, I'm ready for Q&A.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Raul. I have a fact question. I didn't catch how much income the forests give us each year.
Right. So woodland owners get, it depends. It goes up and down. Right now it's down. Economy's down. We're not selling wood. So on average, for landowners in Indiana, it's between 160 and 180 million dollars a year go to landowners. Okay. The economic impact is $10 billion a year, 70,000 jobs, and $585 million of state and local taxes paid in Indiana from the wood industry. So yeah, it's the largest economic impact of any agricultural crop. And nobody knows about it because it's not corn and beans. Right. So looking at this future, since nobody's jumping right in here, there's a lot of potential. When ethanol started, I was talking to a guy who worked for the socialized farming office, and he was saying, well, you know, corn, that's some people push the numbers on BTUs, and we're actually losing BTUs doing corn for fuel. Mm-hmm. At best, it's a little bit better. He says, yeah, we're going to switch to switchgrass because you don't have to plant it every year, and there goes a lot of BTUs just putting the crop out. But after a couple of years of harvesting switchgrass, when you cut it, it turns into punji sticks that shred pneumatic tires. He says, we're going to switch to hardwoods. Well, that hasn't happened since ethanol started. He said, well, it'll be about 15 years. We'll be doing hardwoods. Behind me on the wall, I have 3 10-foot-long single-year root sprouts from hardwoods and 1 8-foot walnut sprout in 1 year's growth. So once you get those roots established, you don't have to replant. You can have them come up, they regenerate the roots. It's kind of like growing asparagus. You cut it, you let the roots regenerate, you cut it, you let the roots regenerate, and this goes on and on and on. You don't have to mess with it. It's a renewable crop. There's a lot of pharmacological issues, potential that we can get. There's 2 plants that are native, spicebush and pawpaw. Heard a very interesting presentation from an academic who'd been studying pawpaw all his life. Apparently it's a free radical attacker. And he'd been rendering down pawpaws and getting the oils and doing testing on it. Well, it's hard to monetize that, so Big Pharma's not into it. There's a lot of potential for both biomass and pharmacological from trees.
Interesting. Yeah, Ed, did you have some questions? Go ahead,
I guess my first one, that $10 billion a year economic impact, that's a huge number. And you've alluded to, or just, I didn't know it, and most people don't. What suppresses that knowledge getting out, in your opinion, Raul?
Careful, Raul. So,
good question, yeah.
Big ag has a lot of economic activity each year. There's a lot of inputs, there's a lot of sales, there's a lot of equipment being sold, there's just a lot going on. The wood industry is different. It's located in certain parts of the state. Landowners, you'll have a sale every 15 years. If you cut it hard, it may be 25 years before you can come back in for a sale. Sometimes Granny gets took on a sale. If you're going to have a sale, there's a brochure on IFWA's site says call a forester first. You need to have a professional in your corner. I don't know. To me, it's intuitively obvious that it's the environmental and the economic thing to do with your land. But it's it's deferred. Okay. The other thing is, you're putting money in. Let's say the best case scenario is you have a woods and you hire a consultant forester to go into the woods and clean it up so it's better economically, which is also better environmentally because those trees are the ones the animals like. Well, you have to wait for a return. You have a sale. Okay. You want to put money back into the woods? Well, once again, you're going to wait 15 years before you get another economic input from that. So we're Americans, we're next this quarter, what's my stock going to be so I can cash out my options? So it's a different time horizon. In Europe, they grow 200 or 300-year oak trees as a crop. That's their plan. I've seen woodcuts from the 1600s from Germany that has what we call a modern North American tree farm on it with riparian buffer, a seedling nursery, a plantation, and doing timber stand improvement from the 1600s. Japan and Germany both at that point looked around and said, geez, we've destroyed our forests. And from the top down, they started doing forestry. So we are a young country. We have lots of woods. And you go to Europe, every square inch, they're trying to grow something. So as you go along the corner of the fields, if it's not square, they've got a tree plantation growing there. Well, we have so many trees. We can be wasteful, stupid as we want to be. Did that answer that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and then the other thing I had was just an observation, and maybe there's a question in it, but you're talking about the two big things: high capital cost, and then a long time before you start turning that capital over.
So that's the harvesting. So it's like if you want to harvest corn, you got to buy a combine. Well, that's a lot of money. Well, if you're going to get a feller bunchers, what they call it's a big machine on tracks. It comes up, grabs a tree, cuts it off. You can back up and lay that top right down on top of the stump, take a knuckle boom, grab that log and set it up behind you where the skidder can come get it. That's a couple $100,000 and it's a tough environment. Hydraulic hose breaks. I mean, it's a very expensive. Plus, like I said, the highest workman comp rates in the state are loggers. So you have a lot of overhead on a logging operation.
Well, and then the other side of it that was enlightening is just the time to harvest from when you plant. And what I was sitting here thinking about, I thought, boy, I thought the bourbon industry had it tough having to wait 10 years for their product to be ready to go to market.
Right. So you can grow trees that grow shorter. So for example, on a good site, apparently the experts tell me you can make more money growing tulip poplar, which is basically a trim wood. It's very stable, doesn't have a lot of grain to it, so you paint it. But you can do 3 turns in 100 years because I don't know, I don't have an MBA, but I know there's Y1, Y2, money today, money tomorrow. Because you get your money at 33 and 66 and then 99 years, you're actually getting more money than if you wait for 100 years. Plus, if you have a tornado come through at year 75, you've gotten paid twice. So there's a lot of risk involved. I could spend a half an hour talking about stupid hunters and ATVs and pickup trucks driving through and over stuff, but there's just it's a risk.
Yeah, the other question I had was in that 160 to 180 million that goes to the landowners in the state of Indiana. I assume that this business is like a lot of others. You have small business people, and you have some big corporations. I'm aware that there's pretty good size, I think, corporate logging operation in southern Park County, northern Clay, that whole area. And you take that 160 to 180 million. Can you give us some sense of how it breaks down between, are there 2 or 3 big companies and a lot of smaller ones, or is it how fragmented is the industry, I guess is what I'm asking.
So if you're talking about land that's producing timber, it's highly fragmented, especially as people die. You start out with 640 and then you split it and split it and split it and split it, and eventually you got 20 acres, and it's hard to have a sale. So there are some corporations that have land holdings that they're managing for timber, but that's not a lot. Really interesting. Every time I think that I'm crazy, I go up to Lafayette on 25. And after you go through West Point, you make that turn, you start going east a little bit. There's some chain link fences with walnut plantations. Those guys have huge upfront costs compared to me. I'm trying to do it as little upfront cost as possible. They have huge upfront costs, and they have their investors convinced they're making money. So there are some industrial landowners, but not a lot. Most of it is just small family holdings. I think the average size is 40 acres maybe. Not my forte, but it's in that range, and it's getting smaller. And as people don't do timber stand improvement, they do what's called high grading. So our forests have been growing for 100 years, more or less, in Indiana. You may have had a couple of timber sales. If you don't put any money back in to go in and knock down the box elder and the trees that don't have an economic value, you're not growing economic value, and your wildlife potential goes down. And when I first started invasive plant control, there was a guy, and I belonged to a not-for-profit, an RC&D, and he would start in on invasives. And it was kind of like the adults in Charlie Brown. You know, after a while, I'd turn my brain off and wah, 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 and then he'd quit talking, and I'm okay, I'm coming back to the meeting now. At that point, he said, over in Richmond, Indiana, Hayes Arboretum, Hayes was the guy who came up with the railroad crossing warnings. He had created an arboretum. They had planted these plants. So this is like 20 years ago. It was $3,000 an acre to remove those plants to start again. I talked to a co-ed down at Rose-Hulman. I'd been working in a Dobbs Park down there helping do invasive control. And she was from New York State, and as a high school eco club, they had adopted a municipal park, put up a fence to keep the deer out, gone in, taken out all the invasive plants, and they'd waited too long. No seed bank, no roots. So everything was gone. They had to come in and reestablish, bring in the native plants that had been taken out by the deer, the earthworms, and the invasive plants. So it's a long-term investment. Most people don't do it. And a big gamble because of climate change. And like I say, there's a number of diseases out there that just are really scary. And we're moving stuff all around the country. We're moving rhododendron plants from California, and they are an alternate host for sudden oak death, which is out there. Bring it into Indiana. We've caught it a couple times in the big boxes before they sold it. I think this spring, I think they actually got out before they caught them. So it blows my mind that we allow that to happen to our potential oak industry. It's just crazy. And I'm a capitalist, but I'm not a laissez-faire capitalist. Right. There's a lot of problems with capitalism that need to be addressed. And one of them is profit at any cost. And that's a cost to us.
Yeah. Thinking about the future in a little different way, I'm thinking about a question you asked at legislative breakfast last fall, Raul, where you had Sharon Nagel taking notes like crazy, and it's what got my idea for us to consider having this very program. And you talked about also the direction that Big Ag is going, that Indiana really would be very wise at this point to invest. You mentioned Germany and Japan. I mean, that's done in other places, to really invest in our managed forests because it helps wildlife. I mean, all the reasons that you have just helped us understand here.
Sure.
Can you talk about that a little bit? How you
right. So I look at the farm every year and I go, why are we farming this? And one of my favorite spots is a 29.5 acre field. It's hell land, highly erodible land. Socialized Farming Office describes it as that. And yes, it was highly erodible, and we quit tilling, and all of a sudden, 5 years later, we have gullies that are 1 foot by 1 foot, and you go across in the combine, you hit the ceiling when you hit that gully. So I took it out of production, and the topsoil was gone from the slopes, had pooled down the bottom. So those little flat areas just before the water left the field, I am growing tremendous trees there. But the rest of it is just kind of sitting there. And the oak trees are doing really well comparatively because they will take a beat up soil. There's something called improbable meat. I don't think I got the name right, but you know what I'm talking about. We're taking corn and potatoes and whatever else, and we're throwing it through a laboratory, and all of a sudden we have meat at the other end. When we can scale that, we've lost all the ethical problems. We've lost the manure problems, and I gotta believe it's going to be more efficient. What's farming going to do then? Well, there's a lot of ground in Indiana that can grow trees that shouldn't really be in row crops. It's either highly erodible or, got a 24 row planter and you're trying to do point rows because your field is not rectilinear. It can be a real pain in the butt trying to get the edges. So there's a lot of ground in Indiana. We could be helping the wood industry make it strong, and provide taxes in Indiana, provide habitat. Looking at the landscape of Indiana, I just don't see, besides the state and a few landowners, people who are willing to go into the forest and put sun on the soil. Yeah, you got to make an opening to get your oak trees. It helps if you burn it, but you don't have to. You got to babysit it a little bit. I just don't see that happening. But if we convert ag ground, oak trees tend to prefer beat up ag ground with like 0.5% of organic material. I have fields where you look at the field and it rains and the water all runs off. You go across the fence line, exactly the same starting soil. It's got 8 inches of duff on it, and the water goes gone, infiltrates, goes in. So in about 20 years, that soil is coming back. The fragipan, the plow pan, has been broken up, and the trees are really taking off after about 20 years. I have a couple of spots that Father planted back in '58 that just sat there for 20 years. And then all of a sudden, poof, it's like you flipped a switch and the trees took off. It's amazing.
There are things that we just don't know. And thank you.
Helen, it's a interconnected, dynamic, complex biological system that we're trying to play with here. And we have absolutely changed it. I mean, we cleared the state. So it's not like it's a pristine wilderness that we need to protect. In fact, I have a cousin in southern Michigan who's a preservationist, and it's easier to do nothing. Well, her woods is going to invasive plants. The trees that are there are the last trees on site, unless she sucks it up and hires somebody to come in and knock those plants down. Well, a lot of the state, I think, is in that glide path where it's over. Not now, but in tree time, things are changing. So,
no, and that probably isn't one of the things that we fight too. Going back to Ed's question, is that concept of the old growth forest, or if you leave things alone, things are better. And so we need lots of education in this way. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, most of us watching or listening aren't able to start a forest farm. We can support legislation and policy that comes up, but would you talk a little bit, Raul, about the merits of having, now this isn't commercial, but having what I've often heard called, and I call myself sometimes, a front yard forest? How do trees improve landscapes and help us all understand them, so we could maybe scale ourselves up to understanding what your work?
Yeah, urban trees are really important. It's a really tough environment: soil compaction, soil pollution, water, impervious surfaces, so the water runs off. But once you get a tree established, it shades and it transpires moisture. I have a $20,000 word from college: the latent heat of evapotranspiration. So as the trees bring cool groundwater up and it transpires out of the leaves, it evaporates. So you have cool water that's evaporating. It will really cool an area down. Shade is good. I mean, I studied microclimates of urban environments, and you get these little heat islands because everything's dark and it absorbs heat. Asphalt's black. So urban trees are really important. It's kind of tough. I have seen these great pictures of they went in and planted a single species and they got wiped out. So they came in and planted another single species and they got wiped out. Now they're in the third shot. So a varied landscape. Some trees don't play well in town. I mean, I do not think walking on walnuts on sidewalks is a good plan. You're going to break ankles. But getting urban trees is really important. Back to out, as you get farther out into suburbia, once again, you got to be careful of leach fields and wires. I mean, people who plant trees underneath power lines are just, they don't have any concept of time, I guess. I don't understand. But trees, yes, I love trees pretty much anywhere. However, there are some trees, the Calgary pear. We had a terrestrial plant rule we just got pushed through. Calgary pear was not addressed because of capitalism. Nurseries have a lot of money invested in their growing stock. They were not willing to say, okay, what you've got planted in the ground, when you sell that, it's over. We couldn't get to that. So if you're going to Indianapolis in the spring, across on the north side of 74, across from where the golf course used to be, just before you get to the reservoir, there's a little triangular field that's been walked away from that is, when I was commuting over there 15 years ago, in the spring was half Calgary pear. It was all white flowers. Beautiful tree, grows fast, spreads like the dickens, takes over sites. So as you get out into more rural areas, managing your woods, hiring a forester to go into your woods and at least tell you, where are you now in time and what are your options going forward? What do you want to accomplish on your ground? Hiring a consultant forester or getting a district forester to come in and work through what you have, what your potentials are, where you might want to start going. It's not going to happen on, well, it has a trajectory on its own and it's going to arrive at a spot. So understanding where it's headed is really important, and talking about what it means, what your other options are, and how much it costs to get there is really important. It's like, you talk to a lawyer about your will, you take your car into the mechanic and say, I hear a noise, can you fix it? But people are not willing to spend money in the woods. So it's...
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on this. So I have about 4 acres. I'm out in the middle of nowhere. This was farmland when I bought it. So every tree on this property I planted just in the last 15 years. And I've gone for variety. So my question is, am I part of the problem? So I've only got 2 oaks, no walnut, no pecan. I've got tulip, peach, maple, lots of maple, pine, birch. You know, and before this presentation, I thought maple was probably the most native and smartest and you know, the right tree to have in this area. So what would you recommend? I just planted like 15 this year.
Sure. Hard or soft maple?
You know, I guess I don't know. Sunburst, red.
Soft. Yeah.
Okay.
So a variety is really good. The climate, okay, so the climate's changing. Their storms are getting more powerful, more rain. We have more impervious surfaces. The water comes up, goes down very quickly, as Friends Creek knows. A variety is good. Something's going to probably survive. If 4 acres, you're probably not going to harvest that. You would have to have the perfect tree in 100 years to have somebody come in and do a 4-acre harvest. It's not going to happen. So you should plant what you want to have on your land. Fruit trees are really good. However, deer love baby fruit trees. So you'd have to fence them. I know Father was really into fruit and nuts. Getting plants that produce food for the wildlife is really good. So fruits, nuts, filberts, hazelnut, that type of stuff.
Yeah, so my concern wasn't necessarily, will it be harvestable? I have no intention of doing that. It was just, I guess my concern was, is there going to be, you know, are the birds going to be taking my trees and invading your area? So yeah.
Well, Calgary, you have Calgary pear, ailanthus, Siberian elm. Trying to think of other trees. There's usually, most of these invasive plants are ornamentals. So when you go tooling around in shrubberbia, people have planted stuff, and it's the bush honeysuckle, the autumn olive, the Japanese honeysuckle, those plants that actually we've gotten a lot of them banned now. So you can't buy them anymore. Burning bush, there's a sterile cultivar out there. Burning bush can be a problem. Privet's a problem. Those landscaping plants are really the ones you need to look out for. Most tree species, not so much of a problem. And once again, you know, I tell my friends in town, I give them the invasives lecture, which I barely touched on. I could go for hours and hours on invasive plants. They go, oh, should I remove them from my backyard? And I said, no, not yet. It's no big deal. All your neighbors have them. So you're not the only seed source. In Raoul's mind, we have a lot of people never going to be employed again. However, they've been saying that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's never turned true, but they're saying it now again, and I kind of believe them. So in order to keep people employed and on the dole, we should start in the national, state, and municipal woods and go through and clean out the invasives. And coming out of that project, it will be a cadre of people who are really good at that and love it. Yes, there'll be some eyes put out on twigs, and yes, some feet cut off with chainsaws. But then we go through the private forests, people who are willing to pay for it, and the people who have cost share. And the final step is a black helicopter landing on your 4 acres and jackbooted thugs hopping out, ripping plants out of the ground, getting back in the black helicopter and leaving. And then we've won. We played golf on the moon out of a 4-wheeler. If we want to clean the landscape of Indiana, we can. How much are you willing to pay for the landscape you want? So I don't think you need to worry. There are consultant foresters out there. If you want to do something, I would strongly suggest IFWA has a list of consultant foresters for the area. You can click on them. They have different strengths and weaknesses. Some of them are very timber. Some of them are much more urban habitat type people. And you can get a professional in. You get professionals, you know, the row croppers, they hire ag consultants all the time, but spending money in my woods, I wouldn't want to do that. So yeah, get a professional in, get some help.
Very good, thank you.
What a great line. Get professional help.
That's like a wonderful note to end on. And thank you so much, Raul. I think, as you say, we could ask you questions about all kinds of things.
And like I say, I probably could go on for 3 days on the subjects that I covered rather quickly here. So thanks for having me, Helen. I appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much, Raul. This
Thanks.
has been excellent and just a good thing to get us thinking about futures in this time when our days are so structured around the news cycle and everything happening. So appreciate everybody's time very much. And Marco will be spending a good deal more time to make this shareable. And we thank you especially for that. And thank you, Ed, for responding to a quick email, and really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you next month for another virtual lunch with the League.